to start. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to today's event. Both those who are joining us in person and also the many people who are joining us online. I think it's kind of a tribute to the interest in this area that we have as many people turning up to listen to our speakers today. Just for information, Theo Kyndinis, unfortunately, has had to drop out of the event tonight. So it will be just Michael and Travis, but I'm sure they will more than make up for the absence. And for those who are eagle-eyed, they'll probably work out that this is not Michael Fiddler, and I'll explain that in a second. So what we're going to be doing for the next hour or so is having effectively a conversation between me and Michael and Travis, who's joining us online from Kentucky, talking about their work and its applications to both in criminological terms and also to policy and practice questions. We're going to be taking some comments and questions from the audience, the invited audience in the room, and then we'll also be feeding back the comments from the individuals online. For boring technical reasons, it's going to be difficult, I think, to involve online attendees in that Q&A. But if you put your comments and questions and observations in the chat, we have a member of staff who's going to be monitoring the chat and will then be feeding back, as it were, the edited highlights of those comments at around 6:45. So the first part of this session, we're going to be talking in particular about the article that Theo, Michael and Travis wrote called Ghost Criminology. I have a copy here. It's a very interesting, quite challenging read in place, but a very interesting read. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what's this all about, ghosts and spectres and all that stuff. Yeah. All sounds a bit kind of crazy, but it's anything but let's kind of have a bit of conversation about that. And then in the second part, we're going to think about how some of those ideas and concepts that Travis, Michael and Theo have developed, we might apply them to, as it were, maybe some immediate and concrete policy questions that many people in this audience are thinking about very often. We're going to be finishing at 7 o'clock for food and refreshments and some further conversation. Now, before we start that, though, I just want to introduce Eamon Carabine. Eamon is the editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Criminology, and it was the Radzinowicz Prize that Michael, Travis and Theo won this year for their article. And so just going to have a couple of minutes, Eamon just explaining how that works and why the judges awarded the article.
Yes, thank you, Richard. So the Radzinowicz Memorial Prize is awarded by the journal, the British Journal of Criminology, for the article published each year, which, in the opinion of the editors and the 7 of us, most contributes to the knowledge of criminology and criminal justice issues. So what the work for the prize involves is each of the 7 of us, independently reading all the articles published in the year, from which we each shortlist 3 articles. And every article that receives 2 or more nominations is then put on a short list or a long list, which we then rank order into first, second and third choices, and then we arrive at a winner. So that's the process. But the criteria for the prize are the originality of the contribution and the elegance of exposition. And every single year we say how difficult it is to choose, since there's such good work appearing in the journal, and often you're comparing apples and oranges. But because the 7 of us are cover all different corners of the discipline, quantitative, qualitative, micro, macro, all corners. But in drawing a distinction, what we find ourselves doing is drawing a distinction between the very good and the great. And so we see our role as judges, as awarding the prize, is that really the eventual winner will have all the hallmarks of outstanding scholarship. And that's tackling urgent questions with verve and imagination. And this year is no exception. So Michael, Theo and Travis's article on ghost criminology is a major achievement, and it insists that the present is not as solid as we might think. And as I'm sure as they'll explain in a moment, ghost criminology is best understood as a conceptual metaphor. What it allows us to do, I think, is to examine disruptive forces. And really what it's concerned with, I think, is the politics of appearance and disappearance. And one of the reasons why criminologists have started to use ideas of the spectral in their writing is because it provides really provocative ways of drawing attention to the unseen, to the invisible, the marginal, the excluded. as well as processes of forgetting, repressing, denial. All of this is really kind of the stuff of criminology. So what their paper is built on is some of that scholarship in criminology, which has already started to ask those kinds of questions. But it also looks back to those turns, those spectral turns that have occurred across the academy in disciplines like history, anthropology, literary criticism, philosophy, sociology. They've all experienced in one way or another a kind of reckoning with these sorts of issues, a kind of rehabilitation of ghosts, if you like. But what they also provide, and which I'm excited to hear more about, is really kind of a framework for exploring the future, for future possible trajectories. So it's on that note that I should slide away and allow the star of the show, Michael and Travis, who's online, to take over.
Thank you very much, Eamon. And Eamon is himself a former winner of the Radzinowicz Prize for the fascinating work that you did on visual criminology. I think maybe that's something we can come back to at another time, because that remains a very important area as well. So I think, as Eamon has explained, there's kind of a deep thinking, there's deep theory, there's some quite rich conceptual kind of ideas at work in this article and in the general discipline of what's become known as ghost criminology. But you try to explain that on on talk radio or the Daily Mirror, then you're going to be laughed out of the room. So I think one of the challenges, certainly the CCGS as an organisation, is that we're very interested and value highly original, deep thinking, but how you translate and convert that powerful theoretical framework into practical understandings, the way that we can look at the world and make sense of it. And goodness, given the world we're currently in, do we not need some really powerful conceptual tools to try to make sense of it? So it's with that spirit that I think the purpose of this, that's the purpose of this discussion. So let's just start with a bit of a discussion, Travis and Michael, about ghost criminology. You have, I was reading your article again earlier, spectral turn, hauntology, lost futures. It all sounds a bit mystical. Ghosts kind of make it sound like it's maybe from an earlier, more superstitious age, but I know that's not what you're talking about in this way. So I don't know, Michael, would you like to start by perhaps giving us maybe the elevator pitch? If you were stuck with a minister saying, what on earth are you talking about? How would you explain what this is about?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, but first off, thank you so much for the invitation to the three of us to speak today, and thank you so much also to Eamon for that introduction as well. That I found that really touching. I hope as a colleague, kind of like quite how influential you've been to the three of us, and yeah, I found that. Yeah, I really did appreciate that. Thank you. I'm slightly alarmed though that one of the criteria was eloquence.
Elegant.
Okay, well, we'll absolutely revisit that in about an hour's time.
Over a beer or two.
Yeah. But also to follow up on something you just mentioned, that kind of idea of this kind of coming up in the popular press and how we might kind of get laughed out of town. I was just very vividly then taken back to some media training that I had a year or two back, which we're going to be talking about trauma over the course of the next hour. Me trying to explain ghost criminology as part of this media training exercise was a truly traumatic event. I think irritated the guy that was trying to teach me how to express things. So yeah, we'll kind of come back to that. So ghost criminology, what does it involve? Well, yeah, absolutely. It's nothing to do with the ghost as we might encounter it in supernatural fiction, although we might well return to that when we kind of come to the Q&A section. It is, as Amy mentioned, well, we're using it as a kind of a conceptual metaphor to explore issues of kind of haunting and the ways in which trauma can sit in place or kind of be revisited. So it's essentially, it's about the ways in which individuals, groups, and particular places might encounter or suffer a traumatic event or something that causes a kind of like a rupture, a temporal rupture for that individual, that group, or that place, leading to that trauma being kind of revisited over time. So that individual, that group, that place might have a kind of an eruption of past events into the present in an unanticipated manner. What we have attempted to do with this particular article is put together a framework to analyse these kinds of hauntings, these revisitings of traumatic or violent acts. And in so doing, we can look at the ways in which particular injustices have developed over time, but also why they have returned or why they can continue to be relevant, why they persist across time. We also touch upon the nature of lost futures. For this, we're drawing upon the idea of hauntology. We'll kind of come back to that maybe kind of in a little bit. And someone called Mark Fisher, his kind of adaptation of the hauntological. And perhaps to kind of give a concrete example of this, I know this is all kind of quite a heady brew, and we will be dropping in specific examples as we go. But if we were to think about climate change and the harms of climate change, we could be said to be haunted by the lost futures associated with climate change, because as global temperatures warm, as we kind of get to a 2% increase or 2-degree increase, a 3-degree increase, so the possible avenues of future that are available to us contract. The particular pathways of the future are lost to us. And so we come to be haunted by those kinds of futures that are going to be curtailed because of harms being enacted in the present. So that's a bit of a kind of a quick overview. Perhaps if I hand back.
Yeah. Thank you. No, thank you. I mean, Travis, I'm just wondering, would you like to build on what Mike was saying and perhaps he gave a really interesting example there about climate change, but your article has a number of examples, and indeed, you know, when we were talking about this earlier in the week, you came up with a number of others as well. So would you like to build on what Michael's just been saying and perhaps throw in perhaps another, you know, couple of examples just to give the audience a bit of a sense of, oh yeah, okay, I can see what you're trying to do here.
Yes, absolutely. And again, I'd like to echo Michael's remarks regarding, you know, our thanks to not only the center, but to Eamon and everybody at the British Journal of Criminology for selecting our article. It's a high honor. So yeah, examples. I think, you know, trying to come up with present day examples based in the United States. So it's where the United States is very well known for its, you know, overtly punitive and exceptional punishment practices. So, you know, if we think about the war on drugs, particularly over the, you know, its last 4 decades, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have been sent to American prisons for relatively minor drug offenses. Simple possession, for instance, in some jurisdictions can result in you know, a sentence of years in prison. So if we think of how that decision or collection of decisions in terms of actual criminal justice policy might kind of reverberate across time and touch lives that weren't actually involved in the so-called crime. Right now, there are 5 million children in the United States that have or have had a parent incarcerated. So if you can imagine the development or your own development as a child and how central oftentimes for most of us, at least, our parents are. And you can almost, you know, think about them just disappearing from your life and how incredibly impactful that might be for someone, a parent gone, for instance. We discussed when we spoke yesterday, you know, the phenomena of police violence, which is also something that I write about. And in terms of, you know, in the article, we try to discuss how trauma or violence or a criminal event can inherit across generations, like how it can be essentially passed down. So if we think about something like police violence, whether it's a fatal instance or not, one of the adaptations to police violence in the United States is a thing that parents call the talk. Particularly African-American families will pre-teach their children how to interact with police to ensure their safety. So in many ways, we can see how, you know, the phenomena of violence and trauma can touch people in this kind of, metaphorical but also very literal sense. You imagine your future conditioned by the possibility of state violence at the hands of the police. And in many ways, I understand that is, a changed future. Maybe not, necessarily a radically different one, but, a changed or lost future nonetheless. And then one other example that popped up as Michael was speaking. So I'm at Kansas State University, which is a land grant institution. So the United States established a number of different land grant institutions to essentially aid in colonization and westward expansion. So Kansas State was established in 1862 for those purposes, to help settlers create farms, things of this nature. One of the things that the settlers did as they established farms and began farming was encounter the graves of indigenous people. And so those graves were brought by farmers, but also by university archaeologists to the university. So presently, right now, I'm on the second floor of Waters Hall in Manhattan, Kansas, and there are over 200 Native American remains directly below my office. And so this is something that was just kind of seen as an archaeological artifact, an object for study for decades. But if we can think of it from the perspective of the tribes that were here before colonization, um, colonization and conquest never ended. Their remains and artifacts are still held in university buildings. So, in terms of policy applications or implications for this sort of framework of understanding, we can see how policy changes. One of the things that Kansas State has been committed to over the last few years is repatriating remains of Native American people. And you can see how, I think Michael used the phrase, or maybe it was Eamon, things are in a lot of ways never over. And that's something that ghost criminology, I think, helps us think about.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
But I think that example of the Native American graves, and there's a point that Michael made earlier, and also Eamon, about the notion of disappearance.
Yeah.
It reminds me, I mean, a very different context, but one of our someone that we do quite a lot of work with on and off, who's not actually formally from a criminal justice background, but is very interested and concerned about the state of the prison system. And he had a very interesting, actually upsetting example recently, where he'd been speaking to a family member who'd been trying to get in touch with a prisoner in prison, and because there was a family issue, so that the prisoner did not want to hear from the family. And because of that, they just literally could not find where the prisoner was. They couldn't find what institution they're in. And this contact of ours was saying, I feel like writing to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on disappeared people, because this individual has been disappeared by the state. And I suppose prisons are a form of disappearance, aren't they? They're a way of putting people behind walls, and we kind of forget about them. But as you were saying, Travis, it's never really over. It might kind of feel, the present might feel very at times quite oppressive and overwhelming. But actually, we have agency in that to both address the issues of the present, but also to try to build a better future, whilst also dealing with all that's come from the past, which continues to condition, how we can think about what's possible in the future. Anyway, I'm at risk now of kind of sounding like another participant in this discussion. I'm trying to facilitate rather than share it, but it was just promptly. Michael, do you want to? There are some other examples in your article. We've got a couple of minutes. And then what I want to do is open it up to the audience here, because I'm sure you will have some thoughts on that. So I'm just wondering, is there anything else from the article that you think we should bring about?
Captures it, yeah. So one of the examples from the article that comes from the edited collection titled Ghost Criminology that Travis and I put together a few years back, was written by Alison Young. It's a really moving piece about her repeated visits to the site of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and the ways in which she joined in with the memorial marches kind of in and around the area over several years. And she talks about the ways in which the tragedy is not allowed to slip into the past. It's a sort of a memory that stays ever present. In some ways, it's a temporal wound that is perpetually open. And in some respects, that's an important thing. It's an important thing for it to stay present in people's minds. But we might think about the ways in which that temporal wound can be healed, and what are the ways in which that can be facilitated? What are the ways in which, as criminologists, as practitioners, we might be able to facilitate that? And just to kind of give a popular cultural reference, Alison Young makes reference to the artist Loki, and particularly their track Ghosts of Grenfell, which, if you have the opportunity to go away and watch it on YouTube, you'll see that it really does capture many of the ideas and the themes that we try to convey in the article, in this edited collection, and in this discussion today. It's about keeping that memory alive, but also drawing attention to the harms, the injustices that still kind of resonate in the present as well.
Thank you. Right, let's take up a couple of questions or observations. Keep them short.
Hi, I'm Malcolm. I'm a criminal defence solicitor advocate recovering, in other words, retired. But more to the point, one of our daughters is a professor of colonial history. And you know where I'm going with this. The fact is that she's had death threats, she's had all sorts of lewd suggestions offered to her because she's opened up what many still see as the can of worms. For example, the Common Sense group of parliamentarians here in the UK have behaved in a way that they ought to be ashamed of. And indeed, some academics have accused her of having no academic heft and so forth. But this is scarcely about her. It's about the exploration of our responsibility, our accountability, if you like, for slavery and the triangular trade that we all know about. I could go on. I promise to be good, and I'll shut up now.
Well, thank you very much, Malcolm. Let's take a couple more points if there are any. Yes.
So 3 examples came to mind. First were Hillsborough, when you were first speaking of Hillsborough. In the States, I was thinking very much of immigration policies that's going to affect future generations. But then on the other hand, I was also thinking of Israel and the Holocaust, how the Holocaust can be used to justify present day actions.
Effective. And maybe one further sort of thoughts? Yes.
I saw the relevance in terms of not so much healing those past harms, bringing those ghosts back to life and making good of them. You can't. But what you do need to understand is the tensions that they bring into relationships between, as your daughter has found, the people who are aware of them and try to bring them to life, and people who think that we've moved on from there. And in particular, obviously in the UK situation, but very much an American situation as well, the tensions between police officers who say, but I wasn't part of that. I understand, what things were like in those days, but I wasn't there. I didn't do those things. It is different now. And they're dealing with people that still carry those memories because it's part of their heritage, just like the Holocaust and so on. And that's where tensions arrive. And I think that's where, in policy terms, we need to be looking and getting a better understanding on both sides of the tensions that brings. And I mean, for all the focus groups I've done with kids in difficult schools in London, I have never come across such stark hatred of the police and real animosity that a focus group I did with a school in West Yorkshire, where the memories of the miners' strike had a far harder impact on that young generation than I found amongst any black kids in London.
Yeah.
And those collective memories can't be erased. They can't be fixed. We can't smooth them over and make it better. But we have to understand the tensions that they create in the present day and get some better mutual understanding, or we will be endlessly in conflict because you get that clash.
Yeah, thank you very much. Now, we only have one microphone in here, and some of the online audience may not have heard. I mean, those were three really amazing questions. So what I'm going to do is just very quickly try to summarize them. So I think there was some really interesting thoughts about, you know, I mean, who are we here? But, you know, the difficult and troubled relationship to colonial history, and about how that can become very political as well, actually, and you know, a kind of a sense of who's responsible here and who needs to take responsibility. A clutch of ideas related to the Hillsborough disaster, immigration, and also the awful conflict in Israel-Palestine, and the way that the past, for example, the awful experience of the Holocaust in the Second World War, the degree to which that at times, and I'm trying to be very sensitive here because I know it's a very, very complex, difficult set of circumstances, how that might be used by some to some way feel that it can justify certain policies in the present. And then the tension between the memory of the past, particularly in this case amongst maybe young men and their experience, or black people more generally, and their experience of policing. And I suppose, you know, within kind of contemporary policy, that sense of, look, can't we just move on? Can't we just kind of, can you just stop talking about these? Let's just talk about the present. And of course, I think the point that Marion was making is actually the present is very much constructed by what's happened in the past. And it's a very, maybe in the past in some kind of historical sense, but it is still very live in the present. So that's my rather inadequate attempt to summarize that. But I don't know, Travis, Michael, do you have any sort of immediate reflections on that collection of thoughts and ideas? And sorry, I'm not sure.
Yeah, Travis, shall I start things off and then
Please.
you can correct me? So in relation to the opening question, I think in terms of colonial history, actually, I'd like to kind of pick up on the expression you mentioned about a possible lack of academic heft, because I think in terms of the critique that's been levied at perhaps the edited collection and maybe the article as well, I think there is this sense of a lack of seriousness about the work that we've been engaged in, because we're making use of the language of kind of like ghosts and haunting. Perhaps that leap to using it as a conceptual metaphor, that perhaps that kind of gets lost, and the work gets interpreted as having a lack of seriousness in its approach. I think what's interesting with that is, and I think maybe we might go on to talk about this, is the criminology over the last 10 years or so has gone through its own spectral turn. And in the article, we trace the increasing numbers of articles that have made use of this language of spectrality and hauntology to explore criminological phenomena. And that spectral turn in criminology has followed on from spectral turns in sociology, and then prior to that, geography, and precisely as I think Eamon was saying in the introduction, how there have been these other spectral turns in other disciplines. And what's interesting for me, almost in a meta approach, is to look at the critiques that were applied to those other spectral turns in those other disciplines, and they follow the same order of initially critiquing the lack of seriousness of the approach, and then critiquing, well, if you're talking about haunting, then everything's haunted, and so if everything and everywhere and everyone is haunted, what's the explanatory value of this as a thing? And we try to engage with those critiques in the article and in some of our responses to the edited collection as well. But I just think it's interesting that we're following the same pattern, as it were. I don't think that was a very satisfactory answer to your question. Perhaps I'm going to come back to that. But yeah, fine.
Travis, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yes. The question of the question of the intersection of colonial legacies and how we try to understand ghost criminology, it comes up repeated. Again, it's really not ever satisfied. But there's a phrase, and Michael can probably tell us where this phrase comes from, and I'm paraphrasing the phrase, but we've already kind of talked about lost futures. But there's also a component of a past that is ghostly and sometimes illusory. So not yet and never was. So the not yet points to futures that we wish would arrive, but they always kind of seem out of our reach because of the decisions that we've made in our present and the decisions that made in the past. But also people cling to understandings of their own history and cultural memory that are largely imaginary, and they cling to those things in the present to help orientate their world. So, we in 2015 in Charlottesville, Charlottesville, Virginia, there was well-known confrontation over statues of the Confederacy that were being debated whether those statues should be taken down. And the protesters, there were protesters obviously on both sides, but the protesters that showed up with torches, they were drawing on a particular sort of understanding of the past, and they were using imagery and forms of signification to purposely to connect to those pasts. So we would wonder, are those pasts that we should valorize, but also, particularly if we think of the lost cause of the Southern Confederacy, there's all kinds of never wases there, right? And you can hear it in everyday language, and you can hear it in our highest offices. Slavery was not racist. It was about states' rights. Enslaved people had it better under slavery than they did upon emancipation. So if we are ever going to break through and get past these blockages, we takes pretty serious reckoning with our histories, and locating the proper histories, I think, is a first start, an important step. So, that becomes all the more important when we now have a presidential administration here in the States that have systematically gone at dismantling existing histories, shuttering exhibits at the African American Museum in DC, for instance, as a way to rewrite the past in the present. And I think, this framework and the spectral turn, as Michael has discussed it, helps us at least kind of map a way forward, I think.
Thank you. Okay, let's move the conversation on a bit to think about some sort of contemporary policy challenges on how this perspective or set of interlocking perspectives, because I think the more the conversation that goes on, it's a collection of tools and ideas and concepts and themes rather than a rigid, way of thinking about things. So let's kind of think. So I suppose one area, which I think probably a number of people in this room and joining us online are probably thinking about quite a lot at the moment, is the state of our prisons, penal policy, the plans of the government to massively expand our prison capacity whilst not actually doing anything even to maintain the existing capacity, anything approaching a reasonable standard, both for prisoners and for staff. And Michael, when we were talking yesterday a bit about this, and you came up with this notion of hauntological impact assessments and lost futures and transgenerational haunting. So just wondering, and you had some kind of, I think, some really sort of setting you up now at this point. You had some kind of interesting, vivid ideas about how this kind of perspective might apply to our thinking about what's happening in our prisons But anyway, I'm waffling at this point. What, have a go, just to give us a sense of that.
Well, I think it relates to the third question that we had just now, and in terms of a notion of temporal justice, and with truly reckoning with harms of the past and how they still resonate and sit with us in the present, as well as looking towards the future. So the ways in which a kind of a hauntological kind of impact assessment might work will be in terms of perhaps sentencing practice, to truly engage with thinking about harms of the past, how they might resonate with an individual, and we might well talk about the impact of kind of transgenerational trauma, and how that sits with particular kind of individuals, particular groups, how that might impact on our understanding of sentencing practice, or what should be done to achieve effective change in the present, but also looking towards the future as well, and anticipating future harms and incorporating that into sentencing practice as well, thinking about the ways in which imprisoning one individual might impact upon their descendants in particular ways. And particularly, we might think about the knock-on effect, as I think Travis was mentioning earlier, in terms of children of incarcerated men and women. So that might be one way in which we could have a think about that. In terms of an expanded prison estate, as we know, the plan is to increase prison estate by 14,000 over the course of the next 6 years. Well, that anticipates particular individuals who are kind of currently in their kind of early to mid-teens will be housed in those spaces that are not yet preempted. Those are potentially lost futures. There are other ways in which we can reconfigure things.
Do children in primary school, or children who've not even been born yet, because once a prison is built, it tends to hang around for quite a long time. So the present generation, in a sense, making decisions for the future generation over which they have no say. Now, in one sense, there's nothing you can do about that. We can't literally get messages from the future, but it points, as you were saying, to a kind of maybe a responsibility in the present for thinking about the implications of our decisions and how they may affect the future. Yes,
no, it just makes me think of that the government want to introduce from July that they're going to take the DNA of newborn babies. And they're claiming, I mean, as you can see, I'm skeptic, that this is entirely for that they're going to track their health, but they can't consent. There's no consent, but it's going to impact the future generation. And that we don't know, because the DNA database that the police kept, they refused to erase lots of records that they kept that are actually illegal. And so it makes me think that they're creating this whole new system for the future that's not being questioned.
Hands are going up, which is great. Let's take one here at the front, and then I want to go to Travis, but I can see Gemma and there was someone else. Okay, so yes, please.
So I had a quick question. Then regarding the prison systems, just in general, like, do you think that to kind of help this and to prevent this trauma from passing on, should criminals be treated better than what we deem they are deserved to be treated as?
So
so I think, I don't think I've ever had this specific question with Travis, or sorry, this specific conversation with Travis. So this might be an interesting experience for both of us. But I mean, I think my understanding is Travis, Theo, and we all come from an anti-carceral sort of position, and so we would like to see. I think this is fair to say, Travis.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
You're not in favour of mass incarceration.
No.
Good to clarify that.
And so I think we would prefer to see prison buildings being decommissioned and perhaps being sites of, ideally, like a transformative justice movement, or being given over to local communities to think about the harms associated with these particular sites. And there are some examples that we can perhaps kind of get into later on. But that would be one way in which perhaps futures could open up as opposed to being constricted. One of the key expressions we use, I think it's from Carla Freckero. She talks about a hauntological approach being one of pure hope, because it opens up our ways of thinking. It opens up us to kind of imaginative responses to perhaps unseen futures. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And Travis, just kind of developing this point. I mean, I guess there are probably everyone in this room and online, I'm sure, has a view on Donald Trump. And maybe not one that can be shared in polite company. But I think in terms of kind of crime and justice policy, perhaps something that he's most well known for recently is his, let's put it, interesting announcement that he wants to reopen Alcatraz, you know, a long closed prison. A prison very much, in a sense, one would have thought, consigned to the past. I'm just sort of wondering whether you have any perspectives from a broadly ghost criminology standpoint on what that announcement, leaving aside whether it will ever happen or not, what that announcement, in a sense, represents.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to make sense of if you know anything about Alcatraz or just the general, capaciousness of Americans' prison system. We're not short on prisons. So opening up, I think Alcatraz at its tops was 200 prisoners. Is that right, Michael? 230 maybe? It's not a large place, and it was shuttered because it was highly inefficient. And so reopening a prison, as he has claimed or wants to do, has to be just, understood as a purely symbolic form of, or a signal to his constituency or the people that oppose him even, that he's going to bring back a past conditioned by a certain degree of punitiveness, tough on crime almost from the moment that he entered, our politics. So I'm thinking here of 1985 and the so-called Central Park jogger case. There was a woman that was attacked in Central Park and brutally assaulted. He inserted himself in that case with the same sort of claims. He took out full-page ads in the Times, kind of stoking this populist bile. The streets are overrun with criminals because our society is permissive and too politically correct. So the headlines were "Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police." And that was 1985. The first thing he did on January 20th was issue one of the first things he did on January 20th was issue a number of executive orders related to criminal justice policy, and one of them was to bring back the death penalty. So here we are again, and again, the death penalty has never went away in the United States. So I don't know what he intends to bring back. It's a signal to sort of the constituency, the public, combative lawmakers, that this is what is going to condition the Trump administration. And another thing that's kind of interesting in the realm of policy, and I'm not necessarily a policy person, in his last administration, and it's going to continue, I'm sure now, but to deal with the overdose crisis that America has seen over the last decade, he declared a national emergency, but his main, at least initial policy prescription was to bring back scary commercials, right? So, bring back the height of the, Reagan era, just say no war on drugs. And we have, again, 30 or 40 years of evaluative studies that show that fear appeal, anti-crime programming is ineffectual, and it may actually be harmful. But again, drawing back to an understanding of a particular sort of past that may or may not have ever existed as a way to communicate, to bring into being a new sort of present and a new sort of future is how we can understand our president hauntologically, I guess.
Because I think it kind of feels to me that one of the things that you're saying here is that, in one sense, these are announcements that seem really kind of, quite absurd.
Yes.
But actually, just like, Grenfell or some of the other things that's been discussed today, the past lives on in the present. This is kind of almost an attempt to resuscitate the past in the present,
Yes.
in a way to kind of say, we are, that's the kind of people we are now. And we, it was some of a terrible mistake that we kind of consigned to the past. So that kind of sense of appearance and disappearance. You know, sometimes we're trying to just pretend that things don't exist anymore. We build a faculty building on the top of a Native American graveyard, you know, or we disappear people into prison. But sometimes there is an interest in policymakers of, you know, kind of re-energy, you know, kind of bringing stuff back that one, you know, thought was maybe disappeared many years ago. So, you know, thank you. That's just really interesting.
Sorry, can I just quickly leap in? So, I mean, it speaks to a misremembered past as well. But on that, and this might be apocryphal, but apparently, shortly before he truth socialed about reopening Alcatraz, on Turner Classic Movies in Washington, they were playing Birdman of Alcatraz. Whether there's any validity there, but I think it speaks to his policy making process.
We're going to take some feedback from those who've joined us online. So my colleague Daisy is going to give us a quick summary.
Just quickly, just some people that have been writing comments in the chat. So some themes coming through are how living with the ghosts of violence can be something routine, almost mundane and ordinary for women across the globe, and the policy challenge that poses. The history of veterans with PTSD and struggles with homelessness, how prisons should be for rehabilitation and public protection, not primarily punishment, and the consideration for how Black, Asian, and mixed heritage communities would understand this concept of ghosts, and whether the police want to make an effort to understand how cultural communities work. You know, if you want to repeat.
Thank you very much. Now, I'd originally said to Daisy, right, you say that, and then I'm going to have a go at sort of summarising it, particularly for the online audience who may not be able to hear everything in the room. I'm not going to try and do that because there's actually a lot there. What we'll do is when we have the follow-up email from this meeting, we will capture those online thoughts and feed them back through the email. But thank you very much for sharing those thoughts, those who've joined us online. Keep sharing those thoughts because we'll continue to capture them, and as I said, we'll consolidate them and pull them together and feed them back to everyone who is here, whether in person or online. It's one of the beauties of Zoom and other things, that we can have much bigger events than we can physically fit in the room, and that's great. Okay, let's have a few more points. Yeah, there's a point there, Mark, and then Carson and Gemma, and then Chrissy there. Yeah.
Oh, cheers, Richard. It's just a reflection on the sentencing review. I was on a call with Gork and some of his colleagues with organisations working around victims, and he asked a question really around what advice we give in terms of families who've been affected by really heinous crimes coming to ministers, and basically this whole kind of thing that we've got at the moment where we have specific pieces of legislation that are named after victims. And, you know, all the discussion around ghosts in terms of the system and what have you, what would be your response in terms of dealing with that? Because it just seemed, it seemed to me there was an cabinet minister there, was even Justice Secretary, and he sounded quite haunted by it really in terms of maybe how policy was allowed to develop in such a way. And what do you do when you have the family who've lost somebody, who are banging on your door as Secretary of State and the media on it with that whole spotlight? What do you do? And it seems to me that a lot of British UK justice policy has been developed in that way.
Thank you. Awesome.
I was just wondering whether you're thinking about the I guess the dangers or the implications of applying ontology into policy making, or if we were to follow Derrida's writing about how calculating for the future and anticipating the future then actually makes it quantifiable and measurable, and kind of goes against this idea of the justice to come, how that can then be operationalized by the criminal justice system, say for example with machine learning, artificial intelligence, where on one hand, there's someone who was speaking about DNA. On one hand, we have what's ostensibly about looking to the future and for future generations, but then that actually being reinscribed into, once again, risk factors, ways to then categorize particularly racialized people and to kind of track them up in that way.
Thank you very much. Jeff?
Thanks. I just wanted to share a really quick anecdote because I think it's really powerful, and that was what I was going to raise earlier, but now I've got a slightly different point, if that's okay, please, Richard. So I reviewed the justice system in Guernsey a few years ago, and I looked at the entire justice system, not just the prison system. But the thing that sat with me, the pattern, I suppose, that came to me the strongest was I went into the prison. There's one prison in Guernsey. I talked to a group of people in prison, and several of them were very young men. They had been in a care system as children, and in Guernsey they get sent to Southampton, so they're kind of literally expelled from the island because they can't care for them on the island. And then these young men are bored in prison, and it sat with me so much that I felt unable not to make a recommendation about it, which the Guernsey government will feature around kind of making peace with the fact that that harm had been caused and finding a way of doing that. I think they were taken quite by surprise by that kind of strength of my feeling about that. But yeah, I think that's just a really interesting example of the layer upon layer of hauntings that we're dealing with here. It's not just the justice system, it's all these other systems as well that are causing these harms and fractures that are not being repaired and then perpetuate into the justice system of the future. But what I was really wanting to say is I'm actually really interested in this. I hadn't come across it before. I was a criminologist. I don't feel like I am anymore. I'm kind of more of a policy person, but I'm getting back to my academic sort of roots. And I presented a paper at the BSc last year, and I used the terms zombie tacit futures. This idea that there are these, well, they are like futures that we're holding that have no real resonance for because they're stuck in the past. So very similar things. And I'm in the middle of trying to write an article with Tom O'Grady from UCL about this, because we interviewed 22 ministers, ex-ministers from the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, and SPADs were in the group as well. And we were just struck by how limited their imagination was. They're holding on to these scripts, what I've called received wisdom, around what can change, what might change, what our futures might be. And I think a lot of that is much more benign than the sorts of examples that we're bringing up here now. And I think in a way the penal reform sector does that too. And I'm not talking about CCJS. I think we're very good at just, disruptive thinking. But I think we've got a lot of received wisdom about what change is possible. And this kind of feeling that we can't do things because of the public and the media and all of this stuff that actually constrains our thinking. And so I'm using more systems and futures as a lens to look at this through. But yeah, I'm really interested in hearing about it.
Thank you. And
Hi, yeah, thank you. Just the whole idea of authority just it resonated with the life stories. My current life stories with neurodivergent and learning disabled men who have been incarcerated, either in secure or in prison. And it made me think about their lifetime of institutionalisation through special education, and then through triple referral units, and then excluded and made invisible, but also highly visible, and the disruptors, and it made me think about their lost futures that they can't know or don't know or want, but are never going to happen. I've also interviewed mothers who've got sons who are in that category, and their lost futures of their lifetime of, to pardon the puns, their life sentence or through their dealing with special education systems and professionals. And in a way, coming back to that, the sort of policy related areas and trying to learn from some of this, whilst we might not be able to change their future and reimagine their future by actually thinking, going right back to how we understand and create thinking through education and for young people who are neurodivergent, learning disabled, thinking about how we then think about their futures and then and knowing incarceration. How can we expect any person to come out of prison and then not reoffend or not go back into another institutionalized system if we haven't actually enabled their enabled any part of their life to not be institutionalized? Yeah, so they are just inherently institutionalized, and yet they're situationally vulnerable. And so it's that kind of like whole idea of wanting and the missing and the unsaid and unknowable, those sorts of things that resonate for me. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So for those online who may not have been able to hear all of that, there was a question about families of victims of serious harmful crimes and what kind of an adequate response might be to their very understandable, you know, kind of realistic and serious pain and sadness that they're caused. The question about how are there kind of risks of a sort of a hauntological approach, you know, looking forward to the future, for example, you know, criminologists and policymakers love to talk about risk factors, or not all criminologists, some, you know, risk factors. So are we kind of maybe forward thinking in the wrong way, thinking of use of kind of terms that might actually, you know, seek to control and stigmatise and close off futures for individuals because of the risks they're perceived to pose. Some interesting thoughts, both about the harm of the care system, particularly in Guernsey, and how we can make peace with that, and also maybe a different way, and a similar way of thinking about what we talk about here is zombie futures. No,
Tacit futures.
Zombie tacit futures. What an amazing phrase. So some really interesting thoughts there. And then finally about just kind of you know, those neurodiverse and maybe the institutionalization of those with neurodiversity and the lost futures as a result of that. And I suppose one of the things for me, this is going to be more or less the last thing I say this evening, apart from just wrapping up, is it feels that one of the strengths of this perspective is that it's telling us stuff we know. We actually know all of this in many ways, but it's helping to maybe provide some quite powerful analytical tools for trying to consolidate that thinking in a more, dare I say, organized way, you know, in a way that kind of we can kind of make sense of some of these really profound challenges in a way that, you know, kind of, you know, we can kind of think through and think beyond and think forward. So that's it for me, but I do want to kind of give both Michael and Travis a chance to maybe say some closing reflections, maybe based on those questions or more generally. So Michael, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you so much for those thoughts and questions and responses, and thank you all for coming along this evening as well. I really did appreciate that. I'll touch, I think, briefly on the risks of taking a hauntological approach, as well as perhaps the lack of imagination that's within policymakers, because I was struck by something that the documentary maker Adam Curtis said on a podcast fairly recently. You may know, or we might already have seen. It's got a new series out called Shifty. It's available on the iPlayer, which is a hauntological experience par excellence. So I can thoroughly recommend it, and it's got a great soundtrack as well. But something that you mentioned on this podcast in talking about the broader themes of this documentary related to AI and how AI systems are themselves kind of, in a way, kind of hauntological, because they're feeding our past back to us, summing it up as an ever-living present, or making suggestions for a future, but that are really simply kind of regurgitated things that we've already thought. And so there is a future, or there is a danger to taking those particular approaches, and it's not going to open up the kind of imaginative responses that we might hope. You know, I'll hand back over to.
Thank you. Travis, do you have some final thoughts and reflections?
Oh, yeah, I'd just like to just draw attention to AI. I don't know if this was widely reported over there, but in Arizona recently, the state sentenced a man for murder and forced him to interact with an AI in the form of a victim impact statement. So he interacted and discussed his crime with the AI approximation or the AI ghost of his victim, which was very, very interesting. I did not anticipate that. But yeah, we're out of time. But there was one comment I think by Professor Walkley about the normalization of crime and crimes, particularly to marginalized people. We can go one further and just say, it's not only normalized, it's commodified and commoditized. So the whole field of true crime is shot through with this kind of thinking, right? A crime not only sits or lives on in the form of documentaries and books and those sorts of things, but it transforms everyday objects into something you can purchase in the form of murderabilia. So these things are our doing, and if we find them objectionable, then we can make decisions to undo them.
Thank you very much, Travis. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, the British Journal of Criminology, for awarding this wonderful prize to Bear and Theo's article. And thank you for those who've come along in person and also joined us online. Really appreciate it. I think this discussion has shown us there is a lot to ghosts and ghost criminology, which might be spooky, but it's actually not superstitious. It's not kind of, it's actually there's a lot of theoretical and kind of conceptual heft there, which is very powerful. So I'll leave it there, but do come along to one of our future events. We have another one coming up in mid-July, which I can't talk about yet because we're just finalising it, but we'll certainly let you know about that. And I think it'll be an interesting discussion as well. So without further ado, thank you everyone for coming. Hope to see you at a future event. And for those who joined us in person, I hope that you can stay for a while and continue the conversation and enjoy a bit of food from one of our local restaurants and something to drink, whether it's alcoholic or not. But thank you very much.